All right. Hi again, everyone. All right. So this video is going to be about the 1920s and some of the aspects and changes that were going on in the country during that time period. Okay. All right. Let me just pull it up. All right. So this is the original cover of Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. That's the same one I have. You might have a different color if you have a hard version, but this would be the original artwork. Okay, so what we're talking about is the 1920s. So the 1920s is referred to by a couple different names, all referring to the same time period, but different names. So you might have heard it called the Roaring Twenties. You might have heard it called the Jazz Age. It has also been referred to as the Age of Intolerance, and that definitely stems from the political motivations of the times. But all of those are, the same names for a very specific period of time, 1920 to basically 1929 and the great stock market crash that leads to the Great Depression of the 30s. So it picks up at the end of World War I and ends at the Great Depression. So bookended by some really, really terrible events in America's history. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these pictures here. So we have up in the corner there some dancers, some ladies doing some dancing, right? Prohibition, it's going to be a word we talk a lot about, right? The 20s is the period of prohibition. Cars, right? Cars are pretty darn important. They become something that changes the landscape of the United States, right? The ability to travel without horse and carriage is important. And notice it's women who are driving. Down here, notice the way that this woman is dressed, right? Now, obviously, she's at the beach, but it's quite a difference in terms of dress, right? We have long sleeves, long skirts, buttoned up to the neck, and this lady is showing quite a bit of skin in comparison. Just going to move me here. And down here, people having a good time, having some parties. Women in pants. Shocking, right? Okay. So what might this tell us about the values and the changes that are going on in the United States? That things aren't the way they were in Twain's time, that's for sure. All right, so what are the main focuses that we're going to be looking at today? Obviously, prohibition, right? So prohibition has a major effect on the United States, both because it bars alcohol and creates this whole black market world as a result. And also because of the fact that there is, a whole segment of the country that got a amendment to the Constitution passed banning alcohol. That in and of itself is pretty extraordinary. I'm going to move myself again here. I'll go up here. And then women's rights, right? So what does that mean? Right to vote. Right, women's suffrage movement was occurring. Women were taking on larger roles outside of child rearing. Right, they had jobs. They were kind of finding their own voice, asserting themselves, and not only in terms of their appearance and their jobs, but also in terms of their sexuality. There's a huge change in terms of the arts. It's they're called the Jazz Age because arts and music were changing. And it's the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. So you have You have this Gatsby, taking place, but also at the same time, you have the beginnings of the civil rights movement taking place. This idea that the Black community had so much to offer. And so up in Harlem, the Langston Hughes and many of the Harlem Renaissance poets were producing unbelievable works of literature and poetry. But the music scene was definitely being influenced by New Orleans and jazz and the influence of Black musicians. And obviously, the idea that we survived the war led to the celebratory feel of the 20s in terms of lavish lifestyles and parties that were happening and going on during the time. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about Prohibition. All right, so the 18th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified in January of 1919 and takes place and begins effect in January of 1920. So 1920 is the first year that Prohibition is in effect. What is it? It prohibits the sale, manufacturing, and consumption of alcohol, meaning it is prohibited, hence the term prohibition. All right, so what effect does this have? Well, it creates a black market. Obviously, there were segments of the population who didn't agree with prohibition. And as a result, they created this kind of underlying industry, this new business called bootlegging. And bootlegging, obviously, it's a term that's generally used for the illegal making and selling of alcohol, but it stems from this idea that people used to hide alcohol in their boots, in their bootleg, right? So you could have a flask in your boot, so you were hiding your alcohol that way. But it became a general term for any illegal manufacturing and selling of alcohol. Let's take a minute. I know all of you had gov, right? Government. It takes a great deal of time, effort, and strategy to get an amendment to the Constitution passed. There aren't many of them. So the fact that there was a movement afoot that was successful in getting alcohol banned shows you how prolific the use of alcohol must have been, right? That there was definitely a concern that alcohol consumption was causing problems for the United States, whether it be morally, whether it be financially, whether it be religiously, whatever the reason, there was a wide enough concern that an amendment to our founding document was passed. It's pretty extraordinary when you think about it. All right, so like I said, it goes into effect in 1920. 13 years, basically, Prohibition is in effect, but didn't really stop people from doing what they wanted to do. And so if you've ever heard of the term speakeasy, this is when speakeasies started to pop up. So what were they? They were secret clubs, basically, where alcohol is served illegally. So basically, you'd go into what looked like a regular store. So let's say it was a bakery. So you go into the bakery and it's an operating bakery. There are, pastries for sale and there are people behind the counter. But if you knew, what was really going on, you would approach a door, look like a door to a stock room, say, and there'd usually be like a little window in the door, and you'd walk up to it and you'd go, you'd knock, like had a special knock, and the thing would slide open, and you would have the password or whatever was needed to, whatever the code word was that would get you in, and the door would open and you'd walk in, and it would be a whole bar, basically, behind the walls of the bakery where, music was played and alcohol would be served, and out of the watchful eye of the police. There is a couple scenes, particularly in the movie, where they visit a speakeasy. Nick and Tom Buchanan go to a speakeasy, and Gatsby's there. It is not as poignantly discussed in the novel, but obviously, speakeasies were happening; they were real things. Um, Now, if you notice down in this picture, in this bottom picture here, right, the police are there. The prohibition led to a lot of corruption. You would pay off the police so that they'd leave your speakeasy alone, or they'd turn a blind eye to what they knew was going on in and around alcohol. They would be paid off. The mob, if you are familiar with the organized crime, basically, was on the rise because they were the ones mainly operating these speakeasies and running the bootlegging were organized crime families and members. And so they would pay off the police in order to have them, turn a blind eye to what was going on. That meant a lot of politicians were corrupted. A lot of influential people could be bought so that you could continue to run your illegal bootlegging operation. There would, of course, be times when big, busts of bootlegging would occur so that it would appear that they were doing things correctly. But corruption was a large development out of the Prohibition era. Just want to see what else I want to talk to you about Prohibition. The law was never popular throughout the majority of the United States. President Calvin Coolidge, who was a senator during the early days of Prohibition, voted for the 18th Amendment, and while president kept a very, very well-stocked bar at the White House. So there were plenty of loopholes in the legislation to allow many parts of the country to drink just as much, if not more, than before Prohibition was passed. All right, so a couple things we want to keep in mind. Prohibition banned only the manufacture, sale, and transport, not the possession or consumption of alcohol. So abuse was obviously available. Federal prohibition agents, meaning not states, but federal government enforcers, had no right to forced entry. And so they couldn't just barge into a place that they thought might be operating illegally. They had to be let in. So that obviously caused some problems. Canada was a place where large amounts of alcohol were being smuggled into the country. There was this notion of bathtub gin. So what that means is literally people would brew their own alcohol in their bathtubs or store alcohol in their bathtubs. So, today they would call them, home brewers or micro brewers, but back then they were simply brewing their own beer and wine and grain alcohols, and they'd call it bathtub gin. Whiskey was made available by prescription. I always find that funny, right? That in the same way that we get around some of the laws even today, this idea that it could be used for medicinal purposes, and doctors freely wrote prescriptions for illegal alcohol, and they were filled without question as a means of getting around the law. Unfortunately, right, the law and its subsequent practices that seemed to fly in the face of the law created a little bit of a disdain for authority, right? So you had all these servicemen coming back from World War I, where the military is all about authority, and coming into a world where people were kind of immune to authority regarding alcohol. And it really definitely created a bit of a clash in terms of clash of cultures. Al Capone, anybody who's ever, any of you guys know Al Capone, he was a really famous mobster in Chicago, head of an organized crime unit, and he made his money bootlegging. He, basically became super rich as a result of violating prohibition and running illegal manufacturing and transportation of alcohol. So Al Capone became a very influential criminal during the 1920s out of Chicago. And there are references in Gatsby to phone calls from Chicago and things like that, major cities. And that's Fitzgerald's nod to some of the major players in the bootlegging industry. Like I said, prohibition is about in effect for 13 years, but it becomes basically financially improbable for the nation to continue to try to enforce prohibition. And so eventually, in 1933, the 21st Amendment is passed, and that the 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment. So it was pretty much a failed experiment, and that's how it's referred to. Prohibition is the failed experiment of trying to keep people from doing what they want to do. All right, so prohibition is a huge component of Gatsby, and you need to be looking for elements of that as you're reading. All right, modernism and the jazz age, right? Okay, so modernism may be seen as an attempt to reconstruct the world in the absence of God. So once again, we're talking about the effect of war on people, right? And World War particularly left countries devastated, loss of life, just this feeling that of being abandoned. And so those feelings prompted changes in both literature and music. All right, so we need to consider what literary modernism is, what its elements. So that's what we're going to talk about now. All right, so what is modernism? Modernism is a very conscious break with traditional ways of writing, both poetry and prose. So that sounds good. What does it actually mean? In simpler terms, modernism was rebellion against the formal way of writing. So this is when stories that would have a beginning, middle, and an end might not appear that way anymore, right? It was they wanted stories in terms of their structure to mimic the brokenness of the world. So a story might pick up in the middle. And when we start reading Gatsby, you're going to see time period kind of fluctuations where we begin in the present and we go back to the past and then we come back to the present again. You have to pay attention to what time period is being used during the story. You might have heard of stream of consciousness. It becomes a very practiced way of writing a story. So in the same way that your brain can't kind of focus on one thing for a very long period of time, writers tried to mimic that. So, for example, if I just said to you, all right, I want you to sit in silence for the next minute and think about your breakfast. All right, so I just want you to think about your breakfast for the next minute. right, that's not even a minute. Now, if you really thought about it, you were probably having that conversation in your head that went something like this. This is weird. Why is she asking us to do this? Why are we talking about breakfast? I don't even eat breakfast yet. I don't even eat breakfast ever. I don't know why I don't eat breakfast ever, right? Your brain goes on this kind of like constant momentum of various thoughts, and something pops into your head and you kind of go off on a tangent. That tried to be replicated in the stories, which by the way makes for very difficult reading, but they wanted to mimic the way that a person's brain operated, right? And so there's this feeling of just kind of chaos, and that's meant to reflect the world, right? The world in chaos reflected in writing. So here's a poem by E. E. Cummings, and you want what you want to look at is the structure of it, right? This idea that words and symbols and punctuation aren't necessary. E. E. Cummings was very obviously very known for that. So just even like, taking a look at some of, he uses these small eyes, the idea of lines that are not, formally in a certain way, writing words not just horizontally but vertically, just trying to turn the literary world on its edge and reflect the way that people were feeling in the time period after the war. All right, so elements of modernism. Okay, so first, chaos. Obviously, right, the destruction of the world from the war and society left people feeling very chaotic and frustrated and at a loss for why it happened, right? Um, in many ways, people felt like the United States had involved itself in a conflict in a place over the ocean that really wasn't essential to the United States, and there was this feeling of kind of resentment that we needed to get involved, and so we kind of walked back from that, right, a little bit. It ushers in a period of, I guess you could say, intolerance, right, of isolationism of America first, and this was kind of highlighted by the fact that America refused to join the League of Nations after World War I, right? That it was, no, we're not going to be the policeman for the rest of the world anymore. We need to worry about ourselves. That kind of chaotic feeling that war creates is reflected in the literature. Rejection of social norms. Traditional ideas of gender roles, traditional ideas of what it means to work, different ideas on America and what America's mission should be in terms of the world and itself. So rejecting social norms is a big component of modernism. Loss and exile. Once again, I'm going to move me up here. So again, embracing the individual, right? So putting yourself first, making sure that you were taken care of, but with that came this idea that you're kind of in it on your own. And take a look at this quote over here, right? When people people realize God is truly dead and therefore we are on our own, right? So, there's a famous headline from World War I that said, God is dead. This feeling that, where is God in the midst of war? And so when you think of it, this feeling of isolation comes, right? That regardless of how many people are in a giant city, you're really alone, that no one really understands you, that you don't really have connections with people. They're all superficial. And so, the idea that there was loss and exile and individuality that led to loneliness, right? And this feeling of you're in it by yourself. And that the idea that even though there's tons and tons of people around you, you could be living in the tenements in New York City, but still feel completely isolated and alone. That was definitely tried to be reflected in the modernist books. Um, make sure I'm not missing anything. All right. So those are elements of modernism. All right. The Jazz Age. Once again, I'm going to move me down here. All right. So if you have to ask what jazz is, you'll never know, Louis Armstrong. All right. So, like I said, this is just another name for the Roaring Twenties. So it was a very influential time in music and art. Jazz musicians traveled north from down in particularly Louisiana, right, coming up from New Orleans, and they were creating entertainment for all the speakeasies that existed. And as I said, the Harlem Renaissance was a cultural hub in Harlem, New York, where the origins of the civil rights movement really began. Black musicians, Black writers, Black businessmen, were kind of tired of this idea that they were second class citizens, and so realized that they had their own contributions to make to America, and so really began to kind of merge themselves into what was predominantly white society, and Black culture became in a more desirable thing, right? You wanted some of these popular musicians to play at your parties, so there was definitely more of a mix of race than ever had been before. In the same way that modern literature broke with tradition, jazz broke with tradition, right? There was a feeling of freedom to the music, a feeling of individuality in terms of the way jazz is set up. This feeling that you could do it a different way than what had been done before. So the music definitely mimicked the feelings that were going on in the country. And jazz also, right, helped fuel the women's liberation movement. Why? Because it was music that made you want to dance. It made you want to wear clothes. That made you, made you feel good when you were dancing. All of these things are kind of tied together in terms of, the changes that were going on. All right, so the women's rights movements, suffragists, voting rights, and flapper dresses. So, there was a significant change in the way women dressed, right? We moved from hoop skirts to flappers, right? So showing ankles, showing skin, showing knees, but mainly it was all about women getting the right to vote. And that, of course, is the 19th Amendment. So you have the 18th Amendment prohibition, and then the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. The success of the suffragist movement gave women confidence to make changes in other places in their life. They became more prominent in society. They were able to make headway into areas that were predominantly male. So professional sports, and you'll see in Gatsby, Jordan is a professional golfer. So that is, Fitzgerald's nod to some of the successes that women were able to make in terms of areas that were predominantly male. Education, professional careers, and then, of course, just simply the confidence to change how they dressed. Shorter hairstyles, shorter hemlines, smoking, dancing, drinking. So women really kind of came into their own during this period as well. And it all had its foundations in the success of the suffragist movement. And so here's some examples. Right. So there was kind of an embracing of some masculine traits, right? You'll see in the 20s, there was a lot of women wearing masculine type outfits in terms of dress shirts and suit type things. Haircuts went shorter and kind of more boyish and fun. Dances, the Charleston, and women were able to kind of be able to take care of themselves. And again, this is Jordan from Gatsby. She, she takes care of herself. She has her own money. She travels around by herself. That was kind of reflective of this new attitude that women had during the 1920s. All right, so parties. All right, so what? Whoops, sorry about that. So what made the Roaring Twenties roar? Right, we have to consider what made them roaring, and a couple things go into that. The first, of course, is the stock market. So the stocks during the 1920s, right, became more accessible to more people, and people started to be able to make money quickly by investing in the stock market. However, it was not sustainable. It was in part a lot of the economic policies of the time set up the fact that the great stock market crash of 29 was coming. So first, there was definitely a shift off of people living on farms to the city, right? Urban life, more and more people were living in cities as opposed to the farm. Um, Legislation that favored the development of business and the lack of regulation over those businesses created the climate by which the stock market could, start reaching these heights that were not sustainable. It was doomed to crash, right? We call that the laissez-faire period, right? Government hands off of business, and so it led to the creation of a lot of money, but very, very quickly, and founded on investment abuses. The rise of consumerism. So, what does that mean? It means that department stores started forming, and mass production of things like cars and assembly lines allowed for prices to drop, allowing more and more people to get things that they hadn't thought about before. So, washing machines and refrigerators or ice boxes. So, the mass production of consumer goods led to a drop in prices. And then the concept of credit started in the 20s. So you could buy something on credit, a stove, a car that you did not currently have the money for, and pay it over a period of time. Now, the reality of that, of course, is that you ended up in total cost paying far more than what the item was actually worth because of interest, right? So lenders would charge interest for giving you the loan. So, you were able to buy things, but people used credit and racked up a lot of debt. And so consumer credit definitely contributed to the stock market crash and the Great Depression. People were, living beyond what they could actually pay for, and it caught up to them when the stock market crashed. Now, the consumer good market made it so that families had expendable income, meaning and time, expendable income and time. So, getting a washing machine or a oven saved a lot of time in terms of household duties. A vacuum would allow you some time, save you time, and a lot of that time was shifted and used for entertainment. The 20s is the rise of Hollywood and the film industry, right? With the in 1927, the first commercially released talkie, which is what we called the movie motion picture industry, was The Jazz Singer by Al Jolson, and that was the beginnings of Hollywood and the film industry. And so people would use the extra time and money that they had on entertainment and going to the movies and seeing shows, and it created another industry that was new. It was also an industry that created a lot of rich people very, very quickly. So all of this contributed to why the 20s were roaring. There was a lot of money to be made, and we climbed higher and higher, and we roared right after our success of coming out of World War One, except none of it was sustainable. All right. And so I mentioned earlier that Fitzgerald is part of the lost generation of writers. Basically, this is what people call the generation that came out of World War One, right after World War One. This idea that people were searching for something to fill the void in their life, and they turned away from religion, and they turned away from morals and integrity, and they filled it with all kinds of other things, whether it be alcohol, whether it be get rich quick schemes and riches, whether it was reckless abandonment of things and traditions that were once held dear. All of it caused people to be lost. They didn't know anymore what made them happy. No one really knew or understood who they were, what we were as Americans, where America was going. And so we were lost. And their reckless spending and easy life of the upper parts of the country led to a lack of purpose. And this idea of not having purpose, right? This idea of having so much money that you didn't care for anything anymore, right? That you didn't need to, the idea that you didn't need to work. What did you do with your time, and how did you fill your days, and what gave you value as a person? All of this goes into what defines the lost generation, and it's definitely prevalent throughout Gatsby. All right, so I'm going to post this question on our discussion board today, and I'm going to ask you to consider it. And the question is, going over these two videos today, what do you think Gatsby is going to touch on? What kinds of ideas do you think Gatsby is going to be talking about? Okay, so that's the question for today. I'm also going to be posting an assignment dealing with the epigraph of in the beginning of Gatsby, and I'm going to ask you to do some thinking about that. So, what did I do with it? Hold on one sec. All right, so for those of you who don't, if you just type Gatsby PDF into your browser, you get any number of, right? So the two I would recommend, the first one is this one, and it is a PDF version of Gatsby. And the assignment I'm asking you to consider for next week, because I won't see you again until Monday, is to take a look at this epigraph at the beginning of the novel. So for those of you who have hard copy versions, the title page, right, is where, and you'll see the epigraph is right on the title page there. And it's the same one that is on the screen right now. And I'm going to give you a series of questions about this little poem at the beginning of the book. An epigraph is usually there because it sheds some light on some of the ideas that are going on in the novel. So I'm just going to ask you to consider this little 4-line poem here by Thomas Parker D'Invilliers. And just ask you to make some predictions about the book based on this epigraph. All right, so this link here is obviously a good one for a digital version of Gatsby. You can also use this one here, which is Project Gutenberg, and this is also a free version of the novel. And again, you can see right here on the page is the epigraph. So, there are multiple places that you can, if you find another version that you like better, by all means, you can use that too. And of course, I always recommend hard copies, right? Because you can annotate easier. Of course, if you have a device by which you can write on your screen, you can annotate right on there too. All right, so there's our two different versions. So you have a question to answer and some work to do on this epigraph as we get ready to actually start reading Gatsby. All right, a lot of information today, I know, but it's important that you understand some context. The other part of you, I'm posting 2 videos. They're both short, one on Fitzgerald and one John Green video on the Roaring Twenties that I'm going to ask you to watch. You are responsible for all of this introductory information, okay? All right, everyone. I will be in touch soon. And if you have any questions, you can always reach me by email or on Edmodo. All right, everyone. Take care. Great to be with you. Bye bye.